Hello, welcome to the Learning Playlist, a podcast for the major and general education courses under the tutelage of Mr. Ryan Dave Ryla, USJR College Instructor. This project is a supplement to the said courses and as a means to share knowledge to the public at large. To help the podcast grow, kindly follow us at facebook.com/the learning playlist. And now, on to our show. Hello everyone, and welcome once again to another lecture in Philippine Society and Governance. Today's topic is about Article 5, Suffrage. So basically, let's define first what is suffrage. Suffrage is generally defined, according to the definition that you have on screen, as the right and obligation to vote of qualified citizens in the election of certain national and local officials or officers of the government and in the decision of public questions submitted to the people. When we talk about suffrage, usually we associate it with elections, but as we shall see in this lecture, suffrage is not simply exercise during elections, although it is the most common form of the exercise of suffrage. The nature of suffrage is premised on two things. It is a privilege and a political right. So it is something that is generally given or withheld by the legislature in particular, subjected to constitutional limitations. Also, as a political right, it is confirmed largely by the Constitution, no? Our current Constitution of 1987, and in general, when we talk about suffrage as a political right, this is the prerogative, or rather the right of citizens to participate in the process of government, in particular choosing representatives to craft out not only laws but also to make important decisions for the country in general, as with their term of office, no, or during their term of office. So the principle behind suffrage is one man, one vote, regardless of their social status, regardless of wealth, for example, regardless of achievements in life. So one man, one vote. One woman, one vote as well. Suffrage is not simply the exercise of people to vote in their leaders during elections, no, during every 3 years when we have elections here in the Philippines. Suffrage also has different means or different methods that is utilized for many different aspects of how the people exercise their popular will, no, their sovereignty per se. So in a sense, suffrage can come in the form of a plebiscite. This is basically where people vote for their choice of a proposal, usually in the form of a law, and this is primarily used to gauge public opinion in general. There's also referendum, which is the submission of a law for the people to directly ratify or to directly approve of. No, this has been done, for example, in the case of the 1987 Constitution. And then there's also people's initiative, wherein the people themselves promote, or rather propose and enact a law. Case of this would be, or rather an example of this would be, there have been many people's initiatives in the past, but primarily I remember in the 90s there was a proposition to, or rather there was a proposal, no, a people's initiative was called by certain groups to actually extend term limits, the so-called chacha. So if you remember your history lessons, that's part of it. But I don't remember that many of these actually prospered, no? And all of them actually failed to gain popular support. There's also, well, chacha charter change, that is. via people's initiative, but it never really took off. There's also recall, and this is perhaps the most unique of the methods of suffrage, and this is by which a public official can be removed from office. So instead of voting in their representatives, people can vote to remove their representatives, okay, or any public official for that matter, whether they be executive or judicial, no, sorry, not judiciary, but legislative in position, no? Whether in the executive position or legislative position. Okay. So this is done by a vote of the people after registration of a petition signed by a required percentage of qualified voters. Um, I haven't heard or I haven't had the pleasure of encountering examples about recall lately. So that's it. So who is allowed to vote? This question is central to our discussion on suffrage, as what's the purpose of suffrage if we do not clearly define who are qualified to vote in the first place? Well, here are the qualifications. A person must be a citizen of the Philippines, male or female, is not disqualified by law. We shall see the disqualifications later as we shall progress in this lecture. Then that person must be 18 years of age, has resided in the Philippines for at least a year, and of course 6 months preceding the election in the place where he or she proposes to vote. Now let's talk about um, many of the arguments surrounding the qualifications for voters. In the Philippines, well, the voting age is basically 18. The main question for this is 18 mature enough? Are 18 years old mature enough to make important decisions, political decisions, when it comes to who best to represent them and to vote in their preferred choices of candidates for positions of elected leadership, no, in public offices. So this argument, which you can follow in Hector de Leon's book on the 1987 Constitution. You can go to page 219 for this one. This argument is not only limited here in the Philippines, but also in other countries, in other democracies as well. Are 18-year-old are 18-year-old persons mature enough to vote? And I think this is more subjective than any of the other requirements, simply because the age of 18, while it does indicate some sense of maturity, is really premised on more simply that it is more premised on allowing the youth to actually have more say in not only in elections but in deciding the future of the country in general. So this is again the voting age requirement of 18 is rather subjective, and we might even see that one day this requirement might change, as with changes not only in public opinion but perhaps even amendments to the constitution as required, no? So this is really subject to change and not something that should be considered as permanent by us. Okay, there's also the matter of some requirements that have already been removed. For example, property requirements, which was present in the very first elections of 1907 here in the Philippines. Um, these were, or rather, the requirements at that time were very limited to a certain class of people. In particular, it was limited to men of property and standing in society in the past. So that's why there was a property requirement in the past. However, this is no longer applicable today with the rise of universal suffrage for all Filipinos that reaches the age of 18. Okay, there was also a literacy requirement, or rather, there were many instances that literacy was required, not only in the Philippines, but I'm talking about a global view of democracy at such time or such points in time. but literacy requirement was also largely abolished now because of universal right to vote, no, universal suffrage granted to a lot of people. In fact, in the Philippines, there was also another requirement that is largely not spoken about, and this is the requirement of sex. Nowadays, we take it for granted that the requirement of sex, no, the let's say male or female who can vote, is regarded as universal. It's regarded as largely accepted as fact on face value. But you have to remember that in the past, no, in before 1935, there was no um, women's right to suffrage. Women literally had to protest, had to struggle and fight in some instances for their right to vote. Progressively enough in the Philippines, thanks to the blossoming as well of the American suffragette movement in the past 100 years, no, during the earlier half of the 1900s, women in the Philippines were among the very first in Southeast Asia and in Asia in general to be granted the right to vote in 1935 with the coming of the 1935 Philippine Constitution or Commonwealth Constitution at that time. And alongside with literacy and sex requirements for voting, no, there was also education, basically similar with literacy. I should remove that. Right. There's also tax-paying ability, which is related to property requirement. But again, in general, these are largely removed. And what we have right now is basically universal suffrage for all Filipino citizens who have reached the age of 18. Now, here are those who cannot vote. First, there are inmates. And inmates, in general, those have been judged by courts, no, by the court, to suffer imprisonment for not less than 1 year. So in general, they have been judged to suffer imprisonment for more than a year. No? And then these inmates, they can automatically reacquire their right to vote upon expiration of 5 years after service of sentence. They can only vote after 5 years of release, after they've been released from imprisonment. And this disability is this ability to vote stands so long as it has not been removed by plenary pardon, or these inmates have not been granted amnesty. So another category of persons who cannot vote are political offenders. So these are considered as any person who has been adjudged by final judgment of having committed any crime involving disloyalty to the duly constituted government. In short, those who have committed sedition, and those who have waged, for example, rebellion against the government. Um, these are people who have most likely taken up arms against government or committed treason against the government. And unless they have been granted um, amnesty, for example, or pardon, uh, their right to vote is not restored. Okay, so they they must their right to vote must be restored by the government. And then last category of those who cannot vote are insane or incompetent persons. Insane persons, those who do not have the ability to think right, no, those who are in general mentally disabled or impaired. And then there are incompetent persons, those who are in general those who cannot vote by means of simply let's say mental incapacities. Okay, those who are, to put it mildly, mentally retarded, they cannot vote, but they're not insane per se. Okay, So now, is there, let's say, compulsory suffrage in the case of the Philippines? No, are we really required to vote? The answer simply is no. There is no provision for that in the Constitution. And there are two sides to this argument. No, are people really allowed, or com- are people really forced to vote? Again, no, no, it's not something that is required. No, voting is not required. In fact, there's a proportion of the population, the Philippine population, that abstains from voting either out of principle or simply they do not want to vote, and some are not even or do not even have the time to vote. No, they basically forego their right to vote, and that is an acceptable decision in the Philippines. It is a decision that is actually respected here if a person decides not to vote. That's why, for example, in every elections, there is talk of how many or how much of the voting population actually voted, no, in terms of voters turnouts per election, and that is tallied. That data is tallied and tabulated to compare it with with other elections previously held, especially for presidential and national elections in general. So the argument in favor of compulsory suffrage, of really requiring people to vote, is that the argument in favor of it is it makes people aware of issues and personalities involved in politics. It basically appeals to their standing as key stakeholders in this important political and public process of the country. Then it somehow makes a person realize about the responsibility that he or she has to the state. Uh, Similar arguments with point number one. However, there are arguments against it as well, in the sense that forcing people to vote will likely result to them voting blindly. No, they're just voting out of compliance instead of voting out of an understanding that their vote really matters, and that it's okay for them not to vote if it means they do not have, or they do not support any of the candidates in the lineup, whether it be on the local or the national level. So in this way, there is no compulsory suffrage in the Philippines, although there have been people who have been pushing for compulsory suffrage. But so far, their efforts have been thwarted, and more importantly, people are granted the option not to vote, which is also a democratic exercise of sovereignty, no, of people power per se. No, the sovereignty lies in the people. In this part of the discussion, we shall talk about the principle of ballot secrecy and, of course, its many attached issues. And how about voting as well for, let's say, for those who have disabilities? More importantly, or perhaps more likely, physical disabilities. As we have discussed earlier, that those who are mentally incapacitated, those who do not have the ability to think clearly and to make important decisions for society, especially when it comes to voting, they're not included in this discussion. We're talking simply about those who have, let's say, disabilities, largely physically, and those who are illiterate, those who do not have or who have not finished basic education per se. All right, so let's go first with the first point, the right to vote. There is ballot secrecy because under the principle of one man, one vote, um, a person's choice is basically quote unquote sacred for him or her, no, and ballot secrecy is promised based on two things. First, a person might be coerced into, let's say, or pressured into voting for a certain candidate by means of, let's say, peer pressure from groups, from family, from church, etc., etc. and that might compromise the value of their vote, no? And a compromised vote, on an individual, or perhaps individuals with compromise, let's say, with compromised choices, no, choices that are um, induced by pressure from society at large, because if their vote is made public, um, that might also compromise the quality of the democracy that we have, as we see here, a right without which the principles of sovereignty residing in the people is void. Okay? So ballot secrecy is important in preserving the right of people to exercise their sovereignty on basically on an individual level. So, how about for voting by the disabled and illiterates? And I'm going to share to you a story of how this part of the voting process is quite dear to me. Okay? So, the main problem with those who are disabled, in particular, I'm talking about physical disability, those who are old, for example, and those who are physically disabled, they need assistance. Okay, they basically need assistance to vote. And sometimes the problem is when they vote and when there is assistance involved, those who are giving them assistance can actually manipulate their vote. So how do we prevent that from happening? Well, a few years back, I did work as or I did volunteer as a BOC member, no, a Board of Election Canvasser member, and one of my tasks as a BOC member was to actually assist, especially those who have physical disabilities, or those who are also old, no, the senior citizens. I was asked to assist, and my mistake at that time was that I actually conflated senior citizens as basically disabled. So one mistake I did was when was there was this old man. He was a bit slow already, and he had a physical disability. So he was basically old. No, I wouldn't say he was senile, but he was basically old. And assisting him was his wife, who is as old as him. And so, in order to make way for them in the line, I called out that there's a PWD, person with disability, that was going to vote. And actually, they took offense at this, but my intention was simple. No, um, they were labeled as PWD as per instructions, because the PWD is prioritized. No, old and PWD people are prioritized in the precinct in which I volunteered in. And so they were given a seat, but they felt bad about me calling them PWD, and that was my mistake. No, but I should say that it was more of a thing about protocol, right? My mistake was that I simply followed protocol without regard for compassion, or without regard for how they would feel. So that was my experience as a BOC member back in, I think it was the 2018 elections. So there was that, local elections, that is. So in a way, no, voting by disabled person is actually similar, or it's actually equal to all of the for to all of those who vote, that are all voters who basically vote in elections. The only difference is they need assistance, and in order to assist them carefully, they have to be or the BOCs has to be very careful. No, the BOC members have to be very careful and have to observe certain courtesies to allow uh, the old people and those with disabilities to have a pleasant um, experience in exercising their suffrage during elections, especially considering that people are very irritable during this time. Trust me, I know what I'm talking about, no? So that's it. Okay. So, how to prevent manipulation in voting? So, as I was saying earlier, there has to be a secret ballot, or rather, sorry, not secret ballot. That's the wrong term. There has to be ballot secrecy, so that people are confident that their votes are private and that they would not be pressured by societal groups or by even by family groups that that seek to manipulate the way they vote, no? So the point here is to make election methods easier for everyone. Okay, so there are systems in around the world, electoral systems, that instead of shading ballots, which usually takes a bit of dexterity, especially in the hands, there is a system, or there are systems in which election methods, or rather voting, is done via pressing buttons, no? And there are systems that have become highly computerized as well to prevent fraud, for example. And that concludes our lecture for Article 5, Suffrage. If you want to know more, I would suggest you would perhaps write comments or suggestions in the comment section below as to what can I do to improve further. And I will also be posting links that are relevant to this discussion on Article 5. Um, Thank you for watching, and I will see you again in the next one.